Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Vintage Books Live. Tonight we have Catherine McNeur, and we're going to be talking about her latest book, Mischievous Creatures. And then we're also going to be talking about her previous book a little bit too, and her work as a history professor at Portland State University. Wow, we're starting off good tonight.
Thanks for having
So,
me.
for those of you who pop in live in the chat, just go ahead and post any questions that you have. If you're watching this as a replay, feel free to put comments or questions in the comments. I check those about once a week, so we will make sure we catch your questions and comments. And if you have something that you wanted to ask Catherine and it's after the fact, then please do, and then we will just see how we can get a hold of her. So I'm going to start, Catherine, you're a professor. So, the old publisher perish adage, I suspect, is still in play to a certain extent. But meaning that you write a lot for the academic world, as probably most professors do. What got you out beyond that and writing for the layperson? Because you have a couple books out now. Like, what kind of pushed you to go for the trade market and to maybe a little bit broader of an audience?
Yeah, when I was in grad school, I had mentors who were really big advocates of writing to a broad public audience, not just writing to the kind of minuscule community
Yeah.
of 12 scholars who would be interested in a tiny micro topic, but instead writing something that was kind of narrative nonfiction and uh, more creative in that way, and sort of written with the idea that it should be to a broader audience, and not just because it's been a kind of a crisis among historians where a lot of the bestseller lists are typically political commentators and
Yeah.
journalists who write history rather than folks who are trained as historians. And so there's been some of a kind of a reckoning in the last generation of people who are like, we need to start writing in a different form and not just
Yeah.
in this kind of
Yeah.
highly, jargon filled, just writing within this little tiny community. And so
Do you
I've always been trying to do that throughout.
do you find that across the disciplines of history that's becoming more common for people trained to write for a broader audience?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there are a lot of grad students who work towards that in their training. But I do think there is a place for writing, the kind of micro history too
Yeah,
that is
yeah,
necessary,
yeah. Well,
that
we all have to have
universities
sources, right?
also.
You have to write
Yeah,
that stuff first
exactly.
so that we can write the other stuff.
Yeah,
I write in the
right.
science field, and I think that same reckoning is kind of happening there as well. That, scientists need to learn how to be able to communicate their own work instead of relying on outside people like me to do it. So I've
Right.
seen that happen as well, where more scientists are training in science communication and that kind of thing.
It's all
So
for the
you
best, I think.
and I went on your website this afternoon as I was writing out these questions, and I noticed that um your the area that you seem to focus the most on in your teaching, and then the first book, I believe, is public history, public land, um public or environmental, as opposed environmental in the sense of like cities and people using the land and that kind of thing. And I'm really curious how you went from that. You wrote a history of Manhattan and how there was kind of clashes between sort of more rural land use and more sort of upscale land use in the mid 1800s. And then you came out with a book about women in science, and I'm just
Yeah.
very, very curious. And the same thing with your course list. I was like, oh, by the way, I'm like, I want to take that class and that class. They look really cool. But I can see it there too, where it's public history, it's environmental, it's land use, it's all of that. And then there's the women in science class. So I'm just very
Yeah.
curious how you came to that topic, and that
Yeah.
then ended up as this book.
It wasn't this Mischievous Creatures, this the history of these two women in 19th century Philadelphia. This wasn't the book that I set out to write. Actually, Um, so my first book is Taming Manhattan, and it is, as you described, it's a urban environmental history. It's kind of gritty. There's pigs wandering the streets of the city, and manure issues, and people fighting over public parks, and fighting over sanitation and cholera and everything like that. So it's kind of this like nastier history of early 19th century New York, and environmental battles, the way people were fighting over stuff. And then I had the intention of writing a book about the ailanthus tree, or the tree of heaven, which is it's introduced as an urban tree. It's a Chinese tree that was imported into the US in the 19th century. And it's the tree that people hate now. It's an invasive species, or it's considered that. And it, there's a love-hate relationship, and there's a long history of racial biases because it's a Chinese tree, that's tied into the tree. And so I was writing this long history of this tree and its different role in American society, and kind of poking my finger into the invasive species idea. And then I fell across these scientists. So I was in the archives in the New York Historical Society's archives, and the archivist said, "Oh, you're writing about this tree. You should check out the papers of this botanist named William Darlington. He's written about this tree, and maybe you'll find something in his collections." And so I had this finding aid, which is basically a list of all the letters that he had collected over time. And I'm just going through, and I have just a little bit of time before I have to catch a flight. And I see that there's 250 letters from this woman named Elizabeth Morris. And I did a quick Google search for her, and there was no Wikipedia page. There was really very little about her. I figured out that her sister was an entomologist, and one of the first women elected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And then I had to go catch my plane. And so I wrote their names down, and I said, okay,
Yeah.
that's good. All right. Maybe some rabbit hole to fall down at some point. And the next month, I was back on the East Coast again in Massachusetts, giving a talk, and had a chance to go to Harvard's library to do some research on an entomologist who had studied this tree in terms of a worm that was eating other urban trees, whatever. And so I was going through his papers, and then I fell across Margaretta Morris, Elizabeth Morris's sister, and her letters in this collection just stopped me in my tracks. She said something along the lines of that she had been panting for the sympathy of other scientists, who could appreciate her love of entomology and look past the fact that she was a woman. And I was like, I have to, I'm going to put this tree project aside. These sisters keep kind of popping up, and so then the last 6 years, I've just devoted all this time to researching them and kind of figuring out why they've been erased, and over time, how they disappeared from our records, and trying to recover their lives and their work.
I should have said this at the beginning. I don't think I did. Catherine's book is called Mischievous Creatures. I don't know if you happen to have a copy there, because I'm at home, so I can't hold one up. But if you don't, it's okay. But we have a copy at the bookstore that you can come and see. Oh, yay. And yeah, I just launch into the discussion. I don't know. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. It's all good. But anyway, that's the book that she came out with, and it just came out the end of October. So we've got a copy in the store. And if you buy it, you can have a bookmark too, because I got beautiful bookmarks in the mail today. So so you get caught up in writing about these two women in mid 1800s, early 1800s. I can't remember. I know I looked earlier, and
they're born at the end of the 19th century, or end of the 18th century, and they lived until about the Civil War.
So I just let you talk a little bit more about the book. So you found these sisters. They're important. You are discovering them in all different places. Actually, I'm going to flop a couple questions, because I had said let's talk about this more about this book, but I actually should ask first, at that point, both for you as a writer and just for this particular kind of topic where there's not a lot out there, how do you approach that then as a researcher and as somebody who's like, maybe I want to write about this? Because it's got to be real hard to track stuff down when it's these obscure women. I mean, then this is so true in a lot of different women scientists' case, where there's just not much there. So personally, what's your approach to research in general? And then what did you find when you were researching this particular topic and the challenges?
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, in some ways they were sort of hidden in plain sight. Like they were, a lot of their letters were tucked into the archives of male scientists that they had written to. So people who had been deemed worthy of saving their papers, and because these women were associated with them, and had been corresponding with them, then their letters kind of appear in these collections. So Harvard's botanist had been corresponding with Elizabeth Morris, and so in his collection are some of her letters, things like that. And so the
Yeah.
fact that a lot of archives have digitized their finding aids, and in some cases their letters and the contents of these collections, that made my life easier, because then I
Yeah.
could, it's not exactly as easy as a Google search, but digging into different collections, I could search for their names and figure out
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
where to find that. That was great. I think the hardest collection to the hardest part of the research was that Elizabeth Morris wrote anonymously for
Mm.
agricultural journals, which are basically popular science magazines of the mid 19th century. And she just felt a lot more freedom writing under pseudonyms. Margareta did a little bit too, but she often wrote under her own name. So finding her printed material was a lot easier. But all the pseudonyms, it's like, if I happened to find some hints, like I found her an obituary that an editor from one of these magazines had written for her, and he outed her at that moment and gave a lot of her the
Interesting.
initials that she had used in his magazine. And she would just use like simple initials like ES or just E or something like that, which is impossible to search for within a document.
Yeah.
So you have
Yeah.
to like read all of the things. And then I found at the University of Delaware, she kept an album where she wrote down all of the articles that she had written. And for a time period, she just like wrote some of her anonymous work. And so I was able to
So kind of like a
cross-reference things.
bibliography that she had kept of all of her stuff.
Almost, yeah. It was incomplete, but I was able to figure out a lot more of what
Yeah.
she was doing, and then kind of build out her huge collection. She was a really prolific writer, just anonymous.
Yeah. How do you, I think one of the hardest things about writing history, particularly when you're writing a book for the layperson who wants to be like it, wants to be engaged, and you're trying to avoid it being so dry and all that kind of stuff. But, you don't have the kinds of details and that kind of thing that you would put in a fiction book, for example, to describe who they were or what their personalities were, or that kind of stuff. How do you grapple with that as a writer, and how did you fill in holes?
Yeah, it's really hard, because, and especially these two women, they lived together their entire lives. They never married. They were basically always together, and so they never wrote letters to each other. That was like the one source I would
Yeah,
love to have found is letters
yeah,
between these women, these sisters, and how they were doing it. I could figure out through their anonymous articles. I could see a little bit of bickering because they would refer to themselves with different initials or different nicknames in some of the articles, and they about like their arguments over the kind of fertilizer that they were using in their garden or something like that, the kind of
yeah,
science
yeah.
of what they were doing. But so I could figure out some of that stuff. But you're right, though. There are gaps. Like you want to know about their personal lives or what they're thinking about. I can't reckon with what they were thinking about. That's just an absence. In some ways, I was able to find some hints about, let's say, like Margareta Morris seems to have had relationships with women, but she also seems to have burnt a lot of her love letters. And she made
Yeah.
reference to that. I found little hints of here and there, like she had a cross, like a wooden cross that had her initials and the Civil War nurse Dorothea Dix. She's the head of the nurses in the
Mm.
Civil War,
Yeah,
big
yeah.
reformer of that time period. I think they had a relationship. They had this cross that had both of their initials on it, but all I have is a hunch. Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
don't
Oh.
see them. I
Dang.
know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
Yeah. It's
really I
the
try to be as
vein of
transparent about that.
nonfiction, right? You can't just
I
go,
know.
oh, well, they're just gonna be together.
Yeah, I didn't use euphemisms the way that I think older school historians would have, and just said they were friends. This is a platonic relationship, and just kind of wrote it off that way. I talk very transparently about, like, I think they had a relationship. This is the evidence that I have about it. I can't
Yeah.
know for sure. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um and try to just sort of draw that out, or perhaps, kind of show like perhaps this was what was happening based on what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing. That's what I would guess. And having read all this stuff, this is what I would guess. But it is hard to. I really, there's some really great fiction books about women in science and
Yeah.
history,
Yes. Yeah.
and
I know there was the
I
recent
admire
one
them.
about I totally am blanking on her name, but the gal who really discovered the DNA helix,
Oh,
and I can't remember her name.
yeah,
But there was a fiction book that came out about her, and I suspect that that was the reason that you wanted to be
yeah.
able to tell more of the story, and it's just not
It
there.
speaks
Yeah.
to the absences in the archives, right? The fact that people haven't been as explicit about saving their papers or their materials, and so fiction writers can kind of fill in those blanks where we don't
Yeah.
have them. Like Barbara Kingsolver has her book Unsheltered has Mary Treat is a 19th century entomologist, a real true entomologist
Yeah.
from New
Yeah.
Jersey. And she's a character, a fictional character in that book that kind of runs through. And with Elizabeth Gilbert has the signature of all things. And there's a character in
Mhm.
that book, Alma Whitaker, I think is her name, who is basically like it was almost uncanny how close she is to Elizabeth Morris in terms. They're both born in Philadelphia within a couple of years of each other. Elizabeth Gilbert's character is obsessed with mosses. Elizabeth Morris is obsessed with ferns. They're just like
Yeah.
and they both have like they love very young men. Like it's just this very
Yeah.
weird parallels that it's really uncanny. And I don't think
Yeah.
Elizabeth Gilbert, she seems to have used a conglomeration of different characters, historical characters to
Yeah.
create hers.
Create that.
So she
Yeah.
wasn't using Elizabeth Morris, but it's really uncanny. And
Yeah.
yeah, I can only sit and admire the fact that they
Yeah,
can build out
yeah.
those.
Well, maybe
Yeah,
you'll have to delve into fiction at some point, and
yeah.
so you can edit
Just
whatever you want. So tell us
scratch that itch. Yeah.
now that we've gotten through all the research and how you came to the book. Tell us a little bit more about the book for those who haven't seen it yet.
Sure. So it's this double biography of these two sisters who were quite different. They had the same background, the same education, the same tutors. They lived together their entire lives. They both lived to be 65 years old, and they were 2 years apart. And one was the younger sister is Margaretta Morris, who is a rather famous entomologist of her era, famous during her lifetime, but then completely erased, and we don't know of her anymore until now, I guess. And her older sister, Elizabeth Morris, is a botanist, obsessed with ferns. And they took two different paths in their career. Elizabeth took a more quiet path. She liked to be behind the scenes. She didn't want any fame. She wrote she used pseudonyms. She wrote
Yeah,
anonymously. And she just really wanted to be in the background. When somebody actually gave her credit for something, she got all like up in arms and said that
yeah,
she nearly had a heart attack by seeing her name in print. She didn't want that. Whereas Margareta was really kind of pushing her way into these like huge debates about like the potato blight that was happening in Ireland and in the United States.
interesting.
And she was trying to pin it on things. And she was really elbowing her way into these arguments with entomologists and other scientists of the time period, and kind of wanting to be treated as an equal among the men, and publishing under her own name, and kind of fighting back when people criticized her for being a woman, kind of
Yeah,
stepping into a place where she wasn't 100% welcome. And so the book is about their lives, how they kind of developed strategies to be taken seriously, built networks of other scientists that they worked with, and then after their deaths, how they were erased, and why we don't understand, why do we
yeah,
don't know them, and why there are so many hidden figures that we keep learning about over
yeah.
time. It's all these
Can
women.
you
Yeah.
touch on that a little bit, like it, because the little bit I was able to like thumb my way through the book and just kind of get familiar with it and stuff, and it does sound like they both were corresponding with many well-known scientists.
Yeah.
Some of them were supportive and some of them were not. But they for sure were known at that time period. Was it a conscious erasure, or was it just a we save the men's records and not the women's kind of a thing?
Yeah, it's somewhat, it's mixed. So it's like in some ways they were very deliberately erased by a couple, some insecure scientists who really wanted to show that entomology is a really serious field and look at all these men who are doing it. So we're not going to cite or reference this woman who's doing. There were some times where insects that Margareta discovered were named for men because they were present in the room. And so there were like these minor erasures that happened over time, but some of it wasn't intentional or certainly not malicious. It was sort of like Charles Darwin knew about some of Margareta's discoveries about water beetles. She basically found that water beetles that were in a pond would get fish eggs all over their legs, and they would fly off to another pond and populate it with that fish. And that was a way that the fish were moving from one unconnected pond or lake to another. And he was really interested in this because he was writing on the origin of species and wanted to know about distribution of everything. And he heard the story kind of like through a 19th century form of telephone, where one guy had met Margareta. She told him that story. He goes back to England, tells his friend who's friends with Charles Darwin, who tells him. And then Charles Darwin's like, I want to know the story. I want to hear from this North American lady directly. I want to know what she saw and what she claims to know about these water beetles. But he didn't really believe that it was true because she had already two demerits against her, which is that she was from North America, which is far off from the center of all the science world of his science world in England. And also that she was a lady, and that was another demerit. And she eventually tells the story and gets it. The letter gets back to Charles Darwin, and he looks through it and just like dismisses it. But then he gets a similar story from one of his friends, Charles Lyell, and who had like multiple layers of knowing other people who had seen similar behaviors with these bugs, and he writes that into on the origins, but has dismissed her. So she's not referenced, and so it's like kind of a quick.
How did you learn about this story? If like, I'm guessing he didn't necessarily keep the records of that, but somebody obviously did.
He did. He kept So Cambridge University has digitized amazingly. This is like these kind of amazing archival things. They've digitized all of Charles Darwin's papers, and he kept all these letters that he received with his crayon marks in the margins and his pencil markings, and he like slices through her letter with a pencil to be like dismissing it, things like that. All of his, so it's all there, which has been, and I was able to also find his correspondence with friends where he's dismissing her too. So I was able to build out that story. And in the end, she was right.
That is
modern modern scientists have assessed it, and what she said was actually accurate.
I mean, the archive, any archive thing that's original that you can see the actual thing is just the coolest thing.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah.
But I'm weird that way. So you're taking what you've learned about them, and you have a course at the university that you are teaching. I don't know if it's like a regular one or if it's like a special topics kind of course, but and it looked from the description like you're actually having your students sort of work to resurrect women scientists from out of the backwaters of history where they've been kind of left. And I'm super curious how that's going, if the students have found people that nobody knew about, or at least been able to add to records that were maybe pretty sparse. And it'd just be fun to hear some of the stories of what you guys have been able to do with that class.
Yeah, I mean, so this is totally inspired by my getting into this topic and not finding Wikipedia pages for these scientists and thinking like that needs to be corrected. And my students, so what's hard is it's hard to direct someone to be like, this is the path you take to find a hidden scientist, because it's really you have to stumble on it almost accidentally.
For sure.
And so in some ways that's a hard thing to teach. It's almost luck to stumble on them. That said, Wikipedia is ripe with like little mini biographies that aren't complete, or that are that are written in a way that doesn't actually highlight the people. And so we went searching for that using
Okay.
Wiki EDU
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
a guide. They're really great at partnering with university classes to
Oh,
kind
that's
of
very
get
cool.
students.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my students would find these little snippet biographies of women scientists and then use research techniques to build out the biographies. And so in one case, I had a student named Samantha Bowen who had researched a botanist named Annie Montague Alexander, and she basically, her biography highlighted the men in her life and their achievements. And she was just seen as a philanthropist who
Yeah.
supported these men. And Samantha was able to go through, and by researching her and getting photographs from the Berkeley University Library and kind of building out her collection, turn it into a true biography of her rather than a biography of all the men in her
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And
Oh, that's so
yeah,
cool.
yeah, and so similar things for other scientists, where
Yeah.
because it's been a great experience
That's
to
very
see, and
cool.
the students get like, some of them become diehard Wikipedia editors who want to just like correct the
That's
record
awesome.
and
Yeah, I think
right the wrongs.
Wikipedia gets a bad rap sometimes. Presented to schools before, and the teachers are always like, "Don't use Wikipedia." Da 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 da. And it's like, well, you can't end with Wikipedia, but it's a pretty good place to start.
You
So,
know, and I'll say that the students in these classes come to respect it, like after learning
yeah,
all of the
yeah,
editing that's necessary and all the kind of community, the all there's a high standard of
yes,
evidence
yeah,
needed to build these
yeah,
things out. And so most of them have gone through K through 12 and have been told never use Wikipedia, don't use
yes,
Wikipedia.
yes,
And then they go into it and they're like, oh, okay, I
yeah,
respect how this is still
yeah.
potentially
I
faulty, but there's a lot that goes into this.
it is, and honestly, I think there have been cases where there's most cases where there's erroneous information is, like current celebrity type people, where people will go in and say
Yeah.
stuff that isn't true. But actually, I've found for most everything else, it tends to be a pretty solid starting place. And then, of course, you go down below and get all the sources, and then you're off to the races, because then you can go and find stuff. So it's actually a pretty
Yeah.
tremendous undertaking when you really think about it.
It
So,
is. Yeah.
and it's fun that that people feel like they can add to it too, that students feel
Yeah.
like they can contribute. That's really neat.
What's been kind of nice, having started this project with like not finding Wikipedia pages for the Morris sisters, is that now, because I've been publishing little things over time, that they have Wikipedia pages that I didn't even get
Oh,
involved
fun.
with, where
That's
other people
exciting.
have been using my
Yeah.
stuff to create stuff, and that's
Yeah.
that's been
That's
a
awesome.
delight. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, we were talking about, academic writing versus writing for the trade market. And, you do have to have the academic writing too, to kind of to allow things like that to happen, to have those sources that people can cite and that kind of thing. So I was going to jump back to the discussion of women in science and just kind of broaden it back out again. And I because I'm a science writer, I see some of that, the leftovers of what they experienced, in the sense that, women science is still not the most comfortable place in a lot of cases for women. It's better, there are a lot more women in science, which makes me really happy, but um there are a lot of people who intend to go into science and get there and just decide no way, because it's still a pretty hard place to be in a lot of cases. And I'm wondering what connections you see between what was going on in the time period that you were writing about, and sort of the reverberations that we're still here now.
Yeah, and so what was kind of a almost disorienting thing for me, because I'm coming from, the 21st century and seeing the kind of initiatives for women to join STEM still. And, as a
Yeah.
kid going through K through 12 too, I was in all those like girls in science or girls
Yeah.
in math
Yeah.
sort of programming. But what was disorienting was that there's actually a lot of women involved in the sciences in the middle of the 19th century, like huge numbers. And education for girls in science was actually stronger in the early 19th century than it was for boys. The boys' private schools didn't have the science classes, whereas girls'
Interesting.
private schools did initially. They had more vibrant science classes because boys were training for college entrance exams that were all based on knowing the classics, knowing, Latin
Yeah.
and Greek and
Yeah.
everything else. And so there wasn't space for science. And because women or girls were not seen as going on that path towards a professional path as a lawyer or a minister, that there was more room for science early on. And so there are a ton of women who are involved, these girls and teenagers and women who are marking all of the meteor showers or doing all this stuff, going off on botanizing adventures, illustrating things, or becoming science writers, honestly.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
and you see, as the kind of professionalization is taking place in the middle to late 19th century, this sort of siloing of these women out. Even the word amateur was once seen
Yeah.
as like it was held up as like the ideal for a scientist, that
Yeah.
if you're doing
Yeah.
it for the love of it, it's
Yeah.
pure
Yeah.
and therefore unadulterated. You're not being influenced by some, like mining company that wants to hire the geologist. No, you're just like out there to learn
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have pure knowledge. But then even the word amateur comes to mean someone who is untrained, who
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
it goes from being like that kind of ideal to being a derogatory word that's used to kind
Yeah.
of say that
Yeah.
these are, and that's typically given to women who are not allowed into these like higher ed programs, they're kind of excluded from you're pursuing a PhD, say in the late
Yeah.
19th century. And so that you're seeing that disparity. And then also there's, I mean, there's layers of this that it becomes also about science writers are typically women, and then that's seen as that kind of public
Mhm.
facing synthesizing work is seen as not as important or not as serious,
Yeah.
and as women's work or illustrating and that kind of separation. So they were there and they were part of the conversation. And Margaret and Elizabeth in some ways were exceptional because they were really kind of, or especially Elizabeth or Margaret, was really pushing herself into conversations in ways that other women weren't. But they were also just very typical that there was this larger community, and they had friends who were also writing anonymously who also have been forgotten
Yeah.
because they were doing
Yeah.
that. Uh, but yeah, I think that professionalization, that's where you start to see women separated from this, when it becomes possible to have a career in science and pay the bills that way. It's
Interesting. Yeah. I
that
think
separating.
that's really interesting that it's when I mean it's when the economics shift. It's when that you can make a money at doing this, when you can it can be your job, then it's
Yeah,
split off. And that's there's probably a paper in there somewhere too, just
oh
because
yeah,
it's it's not a hobby anymore. It's not something you're just doing for the love of it. You're actually going to get paid. And I think the same I see the same thing happening with the word naturalist. Like the
yeah,
naturalist, that word used to be like a highly respected term for somebody who was just out there exploring and seeing things and then it kind of fell out of favor. I don't know actually the timeline for that one, but I know that as lab science grew more in
yes,
popularity, that the
yes,
naturalist was not as respected. That word, somebody who was out there in the field, it had to be replicated in the lab. You had to be able to do it in the lab. And
yes.
it's only actually in the last couple decades that science has started to come around and say, yeah, so maybe we're missing things if we're only doing them in the lab. But
Right.
it's just interesting how that, and women were included in that naturalist world as well. And
Yeah.
once that kind of fell out of favor too, it was another sort of splitting it off and making it, well, these are the professional scientists working in the lab, and you guys are just out running around in the fields and having fun. And so,
Yeah. And that's also part of the reason why the women like Margaret and Elizabeth Morris were kind of written out of the histories of science while they were telling those stories, because the men, the biologists, when biology becomes the
yeah,
term and
yeah,
it's no longer the naturalists, or in the late 19th, early 20th century, that when they're telling their own story, they're not going to go back to the like a founding mother in the field. They're
Yeah.
looking for like the founding, like the people who are leaning to what they're doing because they're trying to be taken seriously by other
Yes. Yeah.
scientists,
Yeah.
and like the astronomers or the physicists, and so they're going to show a very masculine path and kind of write
Yeah.
out some of the stories that are happening,
So
not cite them anymore.
I'm curious, is when you think about your topics that you're passionate about, like, do you see overlap between the public and the public environmental of the environmentalism in public spaces and that kind of thing? Do you see
Yeah.
overlap between that and the women in science question, or is it
I,
just kind of two separate things that you're interested in?
no, I think there is overlap. I think it's more of the thread is a little bit longer too,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
these urban environmental spaces and what was going on. But I think that there's issues of power in both of
Mhm.
these
Yeah.
situations. So in Taming Manhattan, I'm looking at the kind of social issues in the city, and whether it's social class or race, how that is impacting the ways that people are trying to control the environment and control the people in a city when they're feeling like the city is out of control or the environment's out of control. So there's power in those sorts of relationships, and who's allowed to have a park in their neighborhood or whatever. And then
Yeah.
in this
Mhm.
one, it's the power again. Like it's about the kind of power relations within science and then also within history too, and like archival collecting and things like that, and whose voices are being saved and whose are being
Yeah.
erased over time,
Yeah.
and what that means for our knowledge of science, because we lost in kind of forgetting about these people, we lose about knowledge about the species that they were studying or the kind of questions that they were asking, and then we lose out in general.
Yeah.
And that's beyond gender. It's all marginalized scientists.
Yeah, because I was actually jumping to a completely random question, which if you don't have a thought on it, it's totally fine because it's kind of out there. But I was just thinking about all the knowledge that we've lost through colonialism and how we've gone in and said, well, this science is better
Yeah.
than you, our science is better than yours. And the idea that I've run across a few times when I've been doing different projects is the idea that Western science is its own science, but that it's not the only valid form of doing science, and how we think of science as being this completely objective, there's no, it just is the right way to do it, right? This is how you do
Right.
experiments and this is how you approach the world. And there's been not this recognition that other ways of knowing are just as valid, and all of that knowledge that's been lost and how that sort of overlaps with the women
Yeah,
and
100%. All these people whose voices are not heard or who are discounted as being untrained, even though they have a different kind of training, whether they're immigrant doctors or they are indigenous people
yeah.
talking about the earthquakes that have existed for generations and have oral traditions about that in the Pacific Northwest. And we
Yeah.
don't learn
Yeah.
about it until the late 20th century, even though we could have known about it much earlier if we hadn't been discounting those voices. So yeah, there's this kind of level of power and how we lose by not being more open-minded about who we're listening to, I think is, or it's, when people sort of poo-poo diversity as just being
Yeah. Yeah.
in the sciences or wherever as being kind of a band-aid or tokenism or something like that. What they're not realizing is that there's all these voices and questions and approaches that we're
Yeah.
losing if we don't have that diversity.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. I've particularly spent some time in the space of like indigenous knowledge and that kind of thing. And it is interesting that the more people you bring on from the more different viewpoints, the more questions are going to get asked. And then the more, the broader the knowledge is going to be. But if you don't do that, if you only have one point of view or only a Western science point of view, you miss quite a lot of things. And that's
Yeah.
been interesting to see the collaborations that are finally happening, and the things that people are starting to understand that we lost for a long time because we weren't paying attention. So,
Yeah.
what, I'm curious, do you have other projects with women scientists? Like, is there something that's capturing your attention that's related to that, or just other stuff that you're excited about that you're poking around in and learning about?
Yeah. I'm not sure what is next. I might go back to that project I was originally working on ailanthus trees and the tree, the tree of heaven, and kind of getting into that. I've been in talks with a biologist at Portland State who knows a whole lot more about the science of these trees than I do, and so we might collaborate in some
Oh, that would be
form on that,
fun. Yeah.
which I think would be a lot of fun to kind of have that mix of cultural history with scientific
Yeah.
understandings of these
Yeah.
trees. Um, but other than that, I'm just looking to
Who
read,
knows
and
what you'll
because
run into next time when you start your tree
yeah,
project? Yeah, no.
exactly. I'm looking for that
10
rabbit
years
hole.
from now, you'll be like, oh, I wrote 3 books, but I still haven't done the trees because I keep getting
Yeah,
sidetracked.
yeah, just fall down some rabbit hole again.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's just sort of the nature of research, especially historical research. I think, you never
Yeah,
know what you're gonna find. And so
sometimes
I'm
going off track is great.
curious, um, do you have favorite sources that I can put in the comments for people who are interested in women in science, and maybe some of these people that, I mean, obviously Wikipedia, but you'd have to have a name at that point. Are there any resources out there for women in science that maybe list some of these people, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's some of these early historians of women, like Margaret Rossiter and Sally Kolstad. They did some enormous work in the 1980s and 1990s, sort of pulling out all of these hidden women and writing about American women in science from a long time ago. And nowadays, scholars are working more on there's even more deep dives into like gender and
Yeah,
science,
yeah,
and kind of looking at masculinity in terms of, and like how that affects the kinds of science you're doing, or like what it
yeah,
means for
yeah,
geologists, and going out on mountain climbing, and who's permitted on those, or how computer scientists wear what X, Y, and Z kind of outfits, as that's like the whatever.
yeah.
So it's there's some really great work being done by these scholars. But yeah, the Margaret Rossiter's she has these huge books about American women in science that
Okay.
really get into a lot. There's a lot of hidden women or not that hidden because they're in the book, but
Yeah,
like
yeah.
women to find, and to build out biographies of, to go and do the Wikipedia pages
Yeah,
for
yeah. So
at
if
long
any of you
last.
out there want to work on Wikipedia.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
do you have any favorite books? It doesn't have to be nonfiction, but any fun books. Since it's getting towards the end of the year, I'm starting to ask people, did you have any
yeah.
favorite books from the last year?
I adore the poet Ross Gay. His books are some of my absolute favorite. The Book of Delights, which is a few years old,
Yeah,
but also
yeah,
his new Book of More Delights.
yeah,
I adore that. And I think that's kind of one of those hidden influences in this book, because I was really eager to these women. You can talk about women scientists and the ways that they're beaten down over time, and it can
yeah,
be a very
yeah,
depressing story of
yeah,
just the silencing. But one thing that I found that was really inspirational in the lives of the Morris sisters is just how much delight they found just in going outside
yeah,
and going
yeah.
for a hike together in the Wissahickon Creek, which is this forest near Germantown in Philadelphia, and kind of that searching for joy. And that's what Ross Gay is
Yeah,
always talking about, like being outdoors and finding joy in the fruit trees at his orchard, or in sort of a grasshopper sort of acting up on a table, or something like that. Like that's those sorts of vignettes. That's the sort of thing that they liked too. They liked to watch. Margaret always referred to the insects she was studying as her little friends, the insects. So they might have been pests. They might have been trying to destroy all kinds of farms and orchards and whatever. But she was really, she kind of was enchanted by them, despite
yeah,
their
yeah.
destructive tendencies. And Elizabeth too, she found a lot of joy in sort of the very common plants in her yard, and studying them closely. And the observations she made on those were ultimately things that men who were doing explorations for exotic plants far off were missing about
Yeah,
dandelions
yeah.
or forget-me-nots or whatever.
Oh, that's very cool. Well, thank you so much. Is there a place? I know you're on Instagram, and I think it's
I
just
am.
your name, right? Is it Catherine McNeur
It's
writer or Catherine McNeur?
yeah, Catherine McNeur, writer with
Okay, yeah,
underscores beneath. Yeah.
okay. So you can find her on Instagram. And are you anywhere else on social media?
That's probably the place where I'm most active. I think I'm
Okay,
also on
okay.
Threads,
Yeah.
the new,
I keep wondering if I want to do that. I'm not so sure yet.
yeah, yeah.
So I will just do quick announcements for everybody. We are coming up on the end of November. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but Small Business Saturday is this weekend. We haven't quite figured out all of what we're going to do yet. There will be coupons involved and also probably something to do with the cats, but we'll let you know. We were sitting down today going, oh shoot, it's this weekend. We got to figure out what we're doing. And we do have one more Vintage Books Live this year. That's next week with Dane Liu. She's a past Vintage Books Live guest, and she has a new picture book coming out in December. So I'm looking forward to talking to her. Then we're going to take a break in the month of December because December is going to be crazy. And so we're going to just put everything on the back burner except for being open and selling lots of presents to everybody. But we'll pick back up with Vintage Books Live probably the second week in January. And then book clubs will also pick up again in January. So be looking for that. So thank you again, Catherine, so much for joining us tonight. It was really fun to talk to you. And I
Thanks so
hope
much
you
for
have a
having
good
me.
Thanksgiving week.